This morning. We thank you guys. Well, I'm just going to share a word that God has put on my heart this morning. And afterwards, if it's okay, we might do something a little bit different and break off into groups and just kind of talk about the application and send each other off with prayer. It's okay to do stuff different at church sometimes on Sundays. But this morning's message is titled, Being Misunderstood. Being misunderstood. Who here has been misunderstood before? You should all have your hands up. We've all been misunderstood. And I want to argue this morning that the only place where being misunderstood can truly be dealt with is in Christ. And so I'm going to use a particular passage. It's going to be obscure to you when we first read it, but trust me and bear with me. The passage that we're going to kind of springboard from is Job chapter 2, verse 9. And it's a strange verse, and I'll provide the context, but this is what Job chapter 2, verse 9 says. This is Job's wife talking to Job. Job's wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." Very friendly word. Heavy word. I'm going to argue this morning that very few biblical characters are as misunderstood as Job's wife throughout the course of church history. In fact, you might even interpret her in the popular way that she's interpreted, which is that she is cynical and evil and sarcastic. Matthew Henry, the Puritan who lived in the 16 and 1700s, he wrote in his commentary this about Job's wife. "She was to him like Michal to David, a scoffer at his piety. She was a troubler and a tempter to him." Augustine, the early church father, he said this about Job's wife. She was Satan's ally. It's an interesting choice of words. John Calvin, the reformer, in classic Calvin way of speaking, she was an organ of Satan, a diabolical fury. And more recently, John Piper said that Job's wife lined up with Satan and becomes part of his temptation. In my opinion, Job's wife is deeply misunderstood and misrepresented by these commentators and most of church history. In fact, I would argue that it's the case in the book of Job that Job's wife is not despised and not villainized and not demonized, but rather celebrated and upheld. Most of you, kind of to provide some context, most of you know the story of Job, but I'm just going to rehash it very briefly. In chapter 1, we discover that Job is the most righteous man on earth. And it says that the accuser approaches Yahweh and says, of course he's the most righteous man on earth, right? Like if he's got everything, he's got all these cattle, all these livestock, he's got 10 children, he's got this beautiful house, beautiful wife, he's got all this stuff, of course he's righteous. So remove all that stuff and you'll see how righteous he really is. And so in one fell swoop, Job loses everything. He loses his cattle, which in those days was a sign of your riches. He loses his livestock, he loses his home, and he loses all 10 of his children, all at once. And then in chapter 2, he goes and loses his health on top of everything that he had lost already. And right after he loses his health and he starts to decline in health, that's when we reach verse 9, and Job's wife approaches him and says, "Curse God and die." Now, most people point to the wife as an example of compromise and evil. And on the opposite side, most people point to Job as an example of strength and conviction and perseverance as he continues to worship the Lord in chapters 1 and 2. That because she expressed herself by saying, "Curse God and die," and because he continues to be faithful to God, it's evident who's on the wrong side and who's on the right side. That's the argument that's made anyway. Here's the problem and the conundrum. Job's wife is not the only one who curses God. Job himself also curses God. Job essentially accuses God of being the author of darkness and of being unjust. Let me cite some verses, if we could get those up. Job chapter 3, 3-5 and 11-12. May the day I was born perish, and the night that said, a boy is conceived. If only that day had turned to darkness. May God above not care about it or shine light on it. May darkness and gloom reclaim it and a cloud settle over it. Why was I not stillborn? Why didn't I die as I came from the womb? Chapter 19, 9-11. He, speaking of God, has stripped me of my honor and removed the crown from my head. He tears me down on every side so that I am ruined. He uproots my hope like a tree. His anger burns against me, and he regards me as one of his enemies. None of that stuff is true about God. Chapter 9, 22-24. He destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When catastrophe brings sudden death, he mocks the despair of the innocent. The earth is handed over to the wicked. He blindfolds its judges. If it isn't he, then who is it? This is all Job. Chapter 9, 17. Job says, he, God, batters me with a whirlwind and multiplies my wounds without cause. So he's saying God is unpredictable and capricious. Chapter 19, 5-6. Understand that it is God who has wronged me and caught me in his net. So in light of those verses, here's a question. Why is it that we uphold Job as this great moral character of such integrity and strength and righteousness and perseverance, and yet we vilify Job's wife, who did the exact same thing as he did? In fact, it could be argued that Job curses God more than she does. All she says is, curse God and die. We've got at least 5 verses here where he's cursing God. If we were to be fair, we should point to him as the villain more than we do Job's wife when we see the things that he said about God. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying we should point to Job as a villain. I'm just saying that if we were to be fair, then we've got to do what we do with one, we've got to do with the other, because they both said the same things. What's actually going on here in the book of Job? What's taking place? Well, I preached a sermon about 3 years ago on the book of Job. It's on our YouTube channel. You can go back and listen to it. I'm not going to rehash it here this morning because it's just such a big book and there's so much to unpack. But just to kind of essentially breeze over it here this morning, Job is theologically confused and deeply, deeply hurt. He thinks that God always, and in every instance, without exception, punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. That's what he thinks. That's his theology, his philosophy of the world, of life. That God always rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. And so his experience of losing everything, despite being righteous, is a complete anomaly to him. It doesn't make sense of the world. It doesn't make sense of God. It doesn't make sense of things that he believed in. And he's so emotionally distraught that he cries out in faith, expressing honestly before God how he genuinely felt. God, this is how I feel. And when you come to the end, after God appears to him, after God restores him, we learn that the point of Job is that God would rather have us talk to him in frustration, even if our frustration is directed at him, rather than talk about him and say all the right things. It's God coming down to our level and coming to terms with our humanity and our emotions. If you read the book of Psalms, time and time again, David is doing the same thing. And that's okay. God can deal with our frustrations. He can deal with our anger. He can deal with our disappointment, even if all of that is wrapped up around him. In fact, he would rather that you talk to him about it instead of pretend like it's not there, swipe it under the rug, and act like it's all good. And so we come full circle. If we interpret Job in that way, then we have to interpret Job's wife in the same way. And this is why she's so misunderstood. She's not a vessel of Satan. She's not a diabolical fury. This is a tender moment between a wife and her husband where she is genuinely expressing her heart. Genuinely just telling her husband how she feels. Her frustration with God. The way that things aren't making sense. I think it's funny that we judge others by their actions, and yet we judge ourselves by our intentions. You might do the same thing as the other person, but you can justify yourself because you knew the intention of your heart before you did what you did. And yet when we look on at others, we point the finger from the outside and say, that is unjustifiable. Because we only see their actions. It's a misunderstanding. Job's wife wasn't being cynical. She wasn't being evil. She wasn't partnering with Satan. This was a tender moment between the wife and her husband. And this is why Job's wife is deeply misunderstood across history. Now, we all know what it feels like to be misunderstood, don't we? The moment where perhaps you say or do something and someone misinterprets your heart, your intentions. Suddenly you're vilified and condemned for it. The moment where you do something that you immediately regret. You do or say something that you just know you want to take back, and yet the extent, the disproportional level of fury that is slung at you because of what you did, it feels unjust and unfair. It's the moment that everyone points their fingers at you and demonizes you because of what you did, even though you were forced to behave in that way given the circumstances you were in. People act this way because of one or a combination of things. Number one, next slide. People don't know and they don't take the time to know your past. Your trauma, the things that you've been through that have hurt you, your sacrifice, the things that you've done for others, the things that you've sacrificed for others. They don't take the time to really know about that. And so miscommunication and misunderstanding happens. Number two, people don't know and don't take the time to know your present. It's not just your past, it's your present. Your limitations, your intentions, your personality, your heart. They don't take the time to understand. Or number three, people don't know and don't take the time to know your future. Where you're going, what your goals are, why you're doing what you're doing. And so you feel misunderstood. And when you feel misunderstood, it's almost inevitably attached to feelings of disappointment, discouragement, sometimes even anger, because it's so unfair the way that people are judging you. We've been misunderstood. And when we feel misunderstood, the effect is typically one of two things. We either attack or retract. We either go on the offense or on the defense. It's the classic fight or flight response. We feel so misunderstood that we either attack the person who's misunderstanding us, or we run away and dig our heads in the sand and pretend like it's never there. And so you can kind of see where I'm going here. It becomes this vicious cycle of hurt people, hurting people, misunderstanding, causing more misunderstandings. Now there's this chart developed by psychologists. They call it the 4 levels of communication. And I actually found this in a sermon by a man named John Tyson, and I found it really intriguing and helpful. All relationships begin at the first step of cliche. When we meet people, we start off with cliches. It's a superficial level of interaction. We ask them questions like, how are you? And what was the weather like last week? Things that are really, really just on the surface. And it feels safe, and that's because it is safe, because no one can get offended when you ask, how was the weather last week? Or how are you going? Or how was your week? It's really safe. It's the first stage of a relationship. But then when a little bit of trust is established, we go beyond cliches and we move to facts. This is where you learn about their story, and you begin to understand that this person has a bit of nuance, that they don't quite fit the boxes that you were putting them in the cliche stage. You see their pain, you see their past, you see their personality, you begin to see the set of assumptions you made about them aren't necessarily true. But even though sharing facts is more useful than the cliches, it's still very safe. It's still very, very safe. And so a little bit more trust develops, and we move to the third stage, which is opinion. We go beyond facts and we transition to sharing opinions. Now we start to get deeper. This is where you feel safe enough to share your genuine thoughts and opinions with someone else. You trust them to tell them how you feel about a particular issue. And that's great. And that moves us to the fourth step, which is emotion. The question is, what happens when, on the third stage, opinions differ? When you and I disagree about how we think or how we see things or how we feel about things, what happens in that fourth step? That's when our emotions kick in. How do we move forward? How do we do community with contradicting viewpoints? And the more serious issue becomes, the more potential there is for the relationship to be damaged. Well, here's what happens. If we don't work through our emotions, then we dismiss people's opinions, we reduce them to a list of facts, and we turn them right back into a cliche. That's typically what happens if we don't work through our emotions. We dismiss people's opinions, we reduce them to a list of facts, and we turn them right back into a cliche. Well, of course he acts that way. He's American. Of course she thinks that. She's a Pentecostal. This is the cycle of misunderstanding. We've all heard of the story, I'm assuming, of the Frankenstein story. This is, I think, beautifully illustrates this point. There's this scientist, this mad scientist, he creates this monstrous-looking thing. And this thing comes to life. And at first, I mean, he has a curiosity about life. He wants to learn how to speak. He wants to interact. But you see at the heart of it, he has a desire to be loved and acknowledged and cared for and accepted. And every time he tries to step into the light, people take one look at him and they reject him. He's misunderstood. They take one look at him and they're immediately repulsed by his appearance. And over time, that constant rejection, like time over and over again, and that loneliness starts to kind of twist something inside of him to the point where it takes over. And he ends up killing the friends and family of his Creator. It's a tragic story, but it shows us the damage that being misunderstood and misunderstanding others causes. So the question that I have for us this morning is, what anchors us? What steadies us when we feel misunderstood? I believe there are two sets of truths that do all the work in steadying us. All the work in anchoring us when we feel misunderstood. Number one, God understands you. People might not understand you, but God understands you. Now, there are two things at play within this point, and they both have to do with God's character and nature. The first is that God is all-knowing. Who believes that God is all-knowing here? I mean, there's nothing He doesn't know, right? He's all-knowing. He knows your past. He knows your trauma. He knows your weaknesses. He knows your frustrations. He knows the situation that you're in when you feel misunderstood. He knows. But here's the thing. I'll share a little secret with you. God being all-knowing isn't enough. It's not enough. I will tell you, I've read accounts of ancient Near Eastern texts from thousands of years ago. They predate the Bible. Of these pagan believers who worship this deity, and this deity is all-knowing. And yet, despite the fact that He's all-knowing, He chooses to flood and wipe out humanity because they were too loud and noisy. It's one thing to be all-knowing, it's another thing completely to be benevolent and kind. And so God is not only all-knowing, He is also kind. And it's the case that God doesn't just know your weakness, He sympathizes with your weakness. He doesn't just know the situation that you're in where you've been misunderstood. He sympathizes with you in that situation because He is loving, because He is kind. To be fully known and fully loved. That's how God deals with us. That's how God sees us, how God treats us. He knows all of your flaws, all of your pain, all of your past. He knows your limitations. He knows your goals and your future. He knows all of it, and yet He still loves you. That's the difference between our God and the pagan gods of the ancient Near East. God understands you. And that is an anchor for when you feel misunderstood. The second anchor is not only that God understands you, it's that God is Himself misunderstood. Or to put it more accurately, God subjects Himself to being misunderstood. Think about the incarnation for a moment. The infinite, eternal God of the universe, the creator of all, the inscrutable one, becomes a human being where he can now be scrutinized. Think about Jesus' life. He's eating with tax collectors and prostitutes, and it's misconstrued as extravagant, sinful living. Think about when he was healing the sick. The story, the whole narrative is spun for him to look like the bad guy because he did it on the Sabbath. Jesus saying, eat my flesh, drink my blood. He's misunderstood. He loses 99% of his followers. Even his disciples didn't understand him. And there's this image, there's this amazing, this fascinating part in the story of Jesus where he's sitting. He's before Pilate. He's being tried by Pilate. He's gone back and forth between Pilate and Herod. And he's before Pilate, and it says that Pilate sits on his judgment throne. The king of the universe being judged by a Roman ruler. And he decides that Barabbas will go free and that Jesus will be crucified. And that as Jesus is then in that moment on the cross, people are mocking him, laughing at him, spitting in his face. Because how on earth would the Son of God, the self-proclaimed Son of God, be dying on a cross? How unfitting for a God. He is the most misunderstood person that has ever existed, because the distance between the reality of who Jesus is and how he was portrayed to be is infinite. If Jesus was perfect and he was misunderstood, then we are naive in thinking that we'll never be misunderstood. And when we are, we don't just have the sympathy of a God who understands, we have an empathy, the empathy of a God who is himself misunderstood. He empathizes with your suffering. He empathizes with your pain. He empathizes with what you're going through, particularly when you feel misunderstood, because he's gone through it all. So let's just turn to application as we close. How should we respond when we're misunderstood? Well, the simple answer is we just look to the formula that Jesus lived. How did Jesus live? 3 simple steps. He processed the emotion, he turned the cheek, and he submitted the outcome to God. That's it. He processed the emotion, he turned the other cheek, and he submitted the outcome to God. Now notice that each of those relates to one aspect of life. So process the emotion, that's internal work. Turn the other cheek, that's horizontal work. And submitting it to God, that's vertical work. And if you do any of these at the expense of the other, friend, you're in trouble. If you process the emotion but don't turn the cheek, don't submit it to God, you're in trouble. If you submit it to God but don't turn the other cheek and process the emotion, you're in trouble. Like whatever way you turn, if you don't do one of them, you're in trouble. So how did Jesus process the emotion? When we read the Gospels, we see this pattern emerging in Jesus' life, that he would regularly go away and be with the Father. You know, I remember about 10 years ago talking to a friend of mine who had just become a Christian. And I asked him, what is the one thing that most stands out to you as you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the life of Jesus? And he says, you know what? How often and how regularly he would go to be with the Father. And this kind of pattern emerges as he becomes more popular in his ministry, the more time he needs to spend with the Father. It's as though the more misunderstood he becomes, the more time he then needs to go and spend with God to kind of debrief that, to process that. If you spend time doing horizontal work and turning the other cheek and forgiving your neighbor, if you spend time doing vertical work and submitting and surrendering the situation to God, but you don't process the emotion, that wound will reappear in the future and it would just become another cycle. If you feel misunderstood, that's not a wrong thing. That's a good thing. It's a sign of life. It's a sign of humanity. You're reflecting the emotions of God Himself. What is bad is when we allow those emotions to take over, to take control, when we find our identity in being misunderstood. So come away with the Father. Come away with the Father. Process the emotion. Sit with Him in silence. Go see a psychologist if you need to. Debrief with a friend. Get real, get raw, get honest. Stare your pain right in the face. Come to terms with it. Deal with it. And don't suppress it any longer. Number 2, turn the other cheek. This is the horizontal work. Jesus is literally silent as He's spat on, as He's whipped. And as He's crucified, instead of vilifying the people who were crucifying Him, He says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. If push comes to shove, the way that we respond to being misunderstood, you ready? Is by allowing ourselves to be misunderstood. It's that simple. The way we deal with being misunderstood is by allowing ourselves to be misunderstood. Even against our enemies. Even when our enemies, those who hate us most, misunderstand us, we allow ourselves to be misunderstood for the sake of love. Of course, we sit down, we have conversations, we try to hash it out, we try and communicate, we try and clarify the misunderstanding. Of course, we do all of that. But if the problem persists, we allow ourselves to be misunderstood. In fact, in my experience, my knee-jerk reaction is to actually impose my will on those who misunderstand me and show them how right I am and how wrong they are. And when I do that, they then feel defensive. And then when they feel defensive, it just becomes this deeper cycle where they double down on what they believed previously, and I feel even more misunderstood than what I had before. So what do? We turn the other cheek. We forgive like Jesus did. And number 3, actually, I might just use an illustration there. I remember one time, my mother-in-law was here from Brazil. So we're from Brazil originally, and my wife is from Brazil, and my mother-in-law was here visiting. And we were showing her around Brisbane City. So we were all as a family going on a field trip to Brisbane City, showing her around. And it was a beautiful day. It was a wonderful day. We loved every moment. And it was time to go home. The thing is that when you drive in the city, it can be quite chaotic and confusing because there's one-way streets, there's like no parking zones, there's very little parking at that, there's bus lanes, so it's really confusing. And so we were there with my mother-in-law and the whole family, and it came time for us to leave, to go home. And we got in the car and we started driving, and then I kind of intuitively thought I knew how to get home. And so my wife said, do you want to chuck on the GPS to go home? I said, no, I know how to get home. It's all good. Moral of the story, listen to your wife. So I'm driving. I had no idea where I was going. And it was a simple click away to go to show us where we needed to go to get home. And I ended up driving into a bus lane. Now, my wife had just told me, babe, watch out for the bus lane. I said, babe, that's not a bus lane. Turns out it was a bus lane. And so I get on the bus lane. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is a one-way street. I can't get out of here. I start freaking out. I'm paranoid that there's a police officer somewhere going to find me or book me or something. I'm going to go to jail. And we're just sitting there. My mother-in-law, I'm freaking out. How do I get out of here? I know. Let me chat to a bus driver. The bus driver knows exactly what I need to do to get out of here. So I see a bus with the driver inside, and I pull up next to him. I'm not joking, guys. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not joking. This actually happened. So I pull up next to the bus driver. There's this older gentleman sitting in the bus driver, in the bus seat, in the driver's seat. And I wind down my window, and I say to him, "Excuse me, mate, I'm really sorry. I've taken a wrong turn. I have no idea how to get out of here. Can you give me some directions?" If anyone knows, he should know. Anyway, without hesitation, he turns to me and just flips me the bird and then looks at me and stares at me with this angry face. And I'm like, what in the world is going on right now? What's happening? My mother-in-law's here. This is what she's exposed to. I can't believe this is happening, right? And now, I regret to inform you, I did not have a holy response. Man, I turned to this guy and I just stared at him and I just smiled, sarcastically, and just gave him a thumbs up, well done, man. But I was processing it later, and God rebuked me. Because I realized, man, maybe this guy's having a bad day. Maybe he lost all his money in the stock market that week. Maybe he lost a family member. Maybe there are numerous tourists who go through that bus lane every single day, and he's just sick of telling them all how to get out of there. Maybe there are people who play practical jokes regularly, young people who just drive through and they block his lane and he can't get out and he's late for his next drop-off. Maybe that's what happened. And when I started thinking that way, I had a lot more compassion towards this bus driver. Even though I felt deeply misunderstood. I just wanted to get out of there. I got in there by mistake. It was an accident. But learning to turn the other cheek. As a knee-jerk reaction, that's the hardest part. As an instinctive reaction, learning to turn the other cheek. Just like Jesus did. Lastly, we submit the outcome to God. Friends, when Jesus died on the cross, the reason why he could endure the cross with such joy was because he knew that God is the judge. The reason why he could endure the cross with such confidence was because he knew that he lived according to how God called him to live, in sacrificial service towards others, in love. And that even if he was crucified, God would vindicate him by raising from the dead. He would be proven to have been right all along because he was on God's side all along, and he was shown to live God's way all along, and he knew that even if he died and lost momentarily, he'd be victorious. That God would vindicate him and raise him from the dead. God is the judge. Friend, there is coming a day where all the wrongs of the world will be made right. All the wrongs of the world will be made. All the wrongs that have been committed against you will be made right. All the misunderstandings that you have gone through, that you've experienced, that you've been a victim of in your life, will be made right on that day. And so you can live in this life with confidence and assurance that you will be vindicated. Because God is a judge. So we're processing the emotion, inward work. We're turning the cheek. We're forgiving, horizontal work. We are submitting the outcome to God. That's vertical work. We're entrusting it to him. We're saying, God, this is too much for me to carry. I'm not going to try and vindicate myself. I'm not going to try and impose my will on others so they can understand my perspective. No, God, I just trust it to you. You'll make it right one day. We would all love a lot more, and there'd be a lot less hurt in the world if we tried to take the time to either understand people or assume the best in them. And so God is calling us as a people to stop the cycle of misunderstanding. To stop looking at the Job's wife of the world and vilifying and demonizing and pointing the finger. To process the emotion, let go of the past. Let go of those who have misunderstood us. Approach those you have misunderstood and ask for forgiveness. Submitting the outcome to God and remembering that God not only understands, but is himself misunderstood. So what we're going to do now is just break into groups of 3. And what I want us to do is just share with one another for 5-10 minutes. Practical application. What is it that you took from today's message and in the Word of God that you will apply in your life and then pray for one another? Just send each other out, bless each other to do exactly what you set out to do and to do that this week. So why don't you go ahead now to break in groups of 3 and share with one another and pray.